So let's start looking at valuation ratios. Basically, we're looking to evaluate the company from its idea of its price. What is its stock price trading for? And is it a fair value, or is it overvalued or undervalued? And how does it compare to others in its industry and its competitors, for example? And really the granddaddy of all valuation stock ratios, and really of almost all ratios, is the price to earnings ratio. You might hear it known as the PE ratio, or price to earnings ratio, or PE ratio. Very famous, one that's used all the time. There's one ratio to know. This is certainly one of the big ones to know. Is the price to earnings ratio. That's why when you go online maybe and you look up a stock price, a stock quote, usually right around there you'll see a PE ratio around that price somewhere. Certainly if there's a little bit of a quick summary of the stock, a little bit about it, you'll usually have a PE ratio next to it. Because you're really comparing the price to its earnings, and that's the formula or the ratio behind it. It's price per share divided by earnings per share. Now the nice thing about all these ratios is you don't have to manually calculate them. You can if you like doing that stuff. They're in most cases not hard calculations, but it's basically the price divided by the earnings is for the PE ratio. And you get that right off the income statement. So if you want to calculate yourself, get that earnings off the income statement, look at its current stock price, and dividing price divided by the earnings per share, or EPS, and doing the calculations around that. But you never really need to do that with any of these ratios. So I'll show you some places to search for them at the end of here, and we look at some ratios so you can kind of see where it's all done for you. But basically PE is the price divided by the earnings. And think of the price to earnings ratio as what you would pay for $1 of earnings, right? So for every dollar of earnings, this is what you should maybe pay in terms of a price to earnings. Now, it doesn't necessarily match that way. Sometimes they're overvalued or sometimes they're undervalued, but that's kind of the idea behind it. And really all you're looking for with the PE ratio is to compare amongst other companies. And the general rule of thumb over many, many years was that low PE ratios are of a value. They're being underpriced in the market. Low could vary by industry, for example, like maybe a technology industry. All might have very high price to earning ratios as far as companies, because people are expecting high tech, high growth things from that, versus a more stable industry like utilities or things like a coal company or things that make electricity that might not have a very high valuation as far as a price to earnings ratio, as far as traditionally, or rule of thumb. Now, what we know in recent market times, rules of thumb can really go out the window in some areas, and certainly price to earning ratios are like that too, where you might see really high price to earning ratios of some utilities, and same thing with technology stocks might be lower, but they tend to be much higher as well too. So the thing is, if that's a higher number, if you have a PE ratio of 15 and another company has one of 10, well, that's a better value as the 10. It's price in comparison to its earnings. Now, there's a lot of other factors that go into picking stocks. Don't just go by the PE ratio, or any ratio for that matter, but it's something that's a good tool comparing. If you're comparing two companies and they're very close to you in terms of what they pay for dividends or income or growth rates or what you think of the company, everything's close, and one's got a PE of 10 and another one's got a PE of 20, well, that PE of 20 might be really overvalued. You're really kind of taking maybe a little more risk that you're towards the top of that stock versus maybe buying something with the lower PE ratio. That's the idea behind it. Sometimes you might hear commentators say, well, this stock is overvalued, or the market is overvalued, or maybe undervalued. But if somebody's saying, oh, the market's overvalued, or this particular stock's overvalued, when they're saying that, they're usually referring to the PE ratio. And they'll usually say, well, the whole market has a price earnings ratio of X, and only 10 years ago it was Y, and in the 50s it was this, 1950s it was this. And they'll have some discussion around that. So if you ever hear these terms about being overvalued or undervalued, or the market or something like that, they're probably talking about price to earning ratios, and use it as a good tool for you when you're looking to maybe narrow down your choices of companies and see how that company's price to earnings ratio compares to others in its industry, and see if that price maybe is overpriced and maybe you want to stay away from it, or maybe it's like really low and you're like, hey, this might be a great opportunity. Consider other things as well, but price to earnings ratio is usually a good place to start.